Claire Sieber. I'm a GP based in West Sussex, and I run the Well-Led provider with a team that you will meet very shortly. And this is the second of our CQC Well-Led series, with each focusing on one of the quality statements under the Well-Led key question. Our first webinar that we ran last month on shared direction and culture is on our YouTube channel if you'd like to watch it. But today we're looking at the second quality statement, which is capable, compassionate and inclusive leaders. So what we're going to do today, first we're going to unpick that quality statement with our CQC expert, Gabby Ashton, and give examples from some recent inspections of good practice and some not so good practice. And then Gabby will grill our providers, a GP partner and a former practice manager, on how they will go about achieving this and ask them some difficult questions. And then I'll talk you through the Well-Led provider platform and how it can help you in your organisation with demonstrating CQC Well-Led and also improving your leadership development and your team development. And then we'll have a chance for some questions at the end. The chat is functional, so please feel free to use it and pop questions in there, as is the Q&A thing, but we can also allow people to raise hands and you can speak to us as well if you'd like. The slides will be made available at the end, as will the recording, and you'll get emails automatically about that. So don't worry about keeping notes or taking screenshots. So let's start with some introductions. Gabby, are you there?
I am, yes. Hopefully people can hear me, even if they can't see me. So yeah, nice to join everyone today. So my name is Gabby Ashton. I am a former CQC inspector. So I worked for the CQC for about 4.5 years, and I've been in adult social care and healthcare for over 15 years now, specialising in compliance and quality improvement initiatives.
Thank you, Gabby. And Gary, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, my name's Gary Hughes. I'm an associate of the Well-Led practice. I've spent 15 years in and around primary care. I support primary care in a variety of ways as a consultant now, but I've also spent 13 years in general practice and primary care networks and provider federations.
Thank you, Gary. And our other colleague, Dr. Kate Ambat, who should be joining us shortly. He's a current GP partner, hence not being able to be here right now because he's probably still seeing patients. He's based in the Hertfordshire area. He's been PCN clinical director in the past. He's been a locality leader involved in his federation, and he'll be joining us later to give us some of his experience in this quality statement, particularly having recently been inspected at his practice. And as I said, I am Dr. Claire Sieber. I run the Well-Led provider with my colleague Oscar Matthew, who sadly can't be here today because he's in New Zealand working. So Gabby, I'll hand it over to you to take us through this particular bit of CQC Well-Led.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so for those of you who joined at the previous webinar, what we're doing is we're tracking the reports that have been published for GP practices as well as residential care homes each month, and then as we move throughout the webinar series, we'll be able to see how the year's looking as well from a inspection number and a rating perspective. So this is just a snapshot for you of February. I'm mindful we are in March now, but the CQC published their data at the end, on the end or the very beginning of each month. So we're just sort of catching up from that sense. But in February, we can see that nearly double the amount of care homes were inspected compared to GP practices. And when you look at the, I suppose it's just interesting for you to have oversight of the ratings that were awarded to different services. Particularly interesting to see that 77% of GP practices were awarded good in comparison to just less than 40% of care homes. But we are still seeing incredibly low numbers from an outstanding perspective. So just 1% and 2% of services received an outstanding rating. And when I looked at March, actually this morning, the numbers aren't any changing, in any particular way from an outstanding perspective. So it is still incredibly difficult to get that, but as Claire mentioned, we'll be looking at extracts of all the different ratings throughout this presentation. So when we move on to the next slide, we'll just see the snapshot of the year so far. So again, mindful it's only been 2 months, but we can see a huge amount of inspections that the CQC are completing, and actually interestingly, the percentages kind of stay the same throughout the year. So yeah, so if we move on to the next slide, we'll be doing a deep dive into this quality statement under well-led. So I suppose what I found really interesting from the quality statement in this one is that the language is actually quite soft on from like when you initially look at it. So the words capable, the words compassionate, and the words inclusive, they do come across as quite gentle words, you know, very kind, giving. But when we actually do a deep dive into it, we will see that a lot of the expectations from a CQC perspective are around processes. So for those of you who are kind of just getting familiarised with the new single assessment framework, there are 2 evidence categories. So there are 6 evidence categories overall that the CQC are looking at, but particularly for capable, compassionate and inclusive leaders, there are just 2 evidence categories that the CQC will be looking at for GPs and for care homes, and that is feedback from staff and leaders and processes. So like I said, although from the outside it seems like quite a soft and a approachable quality statement, we're actually needing to do quite a deep dive into the processes that you've got from a practice manager perspective. So just really quickly on this slide, the bits in purple for you, they're the key pieces of legislation, and we'll be picking those apart in a bit more detail in a moment. And then the green boxes are the additional or best practice guidance that the CQC recommend that you make yourself familiar with in order to demonstrate compliance under this statement. So if we move to the next slide, thank you, Claire. So Regulation 7, again, I won't go into detail of all of the bits of legislation for you. You'll have these slides afterwards to read, and hopefully you'll be familiar with the expectations from a regulatory requirement point of view, but if not, this information is also available on the CQC platform. But really, the intention of this regulation is very much focused on the role of the registered manager. So we're looking at making sure that the registered manager is of good character, can properly perform tasks that are intrinsic to their role, that you have the necessary qualifications, competence, skills and experience to manage the legislative requirements within the CQC, and that you are able to confirm your suitability. So when we look at the ratings further down, you'll see why Regulation 7 is very important. It's one that often gets missed or overlooked because it doesn't fall under the fundamental standards, but it is still a very important one from a registered manager perspective. And really the most important thing within this is to think about how you as leaders maintain your ongoing professional development. So thinking about how you assure yourselves that you are able to meet Regulation 17 and what processes and evidence you will have for the CQC to demonstrate compliance under this particular regulation. So then if we move on to the next slide, which looks at Regulation 18. So this particular regulation is about staffing. And again, I won't go into all of the bullet points for you, but what this is really looking at from a CQC perspective is how you, so you've got yourself as a registered manager or as a provider, so you're demonstrating compliance under one piece of legislation. They're then looking at how you deploy and manage and lead your workforce, which falls under Regulation 18. So there's 2 different pieces there, but essentially they're looking for the same thing, your competence as a leader, with a particular focus on how you can demonstrate that you're capable and inclusive and show compassion and kindness across the workforce. So here you need to be thinking about, are your staff suitably qualified, competent, skilled and experienced? Have you as a leader considered the different levels of skills that your workforce would need to meet the expectations or the service delivery plan? You need to make sure that you've got a robust induction in place. So sometimes when I meet with providers, they think that the legislation doesn't give as much detail as they would like. So, you know, there's a bit of a myth. Do we need appraisals? Do we need supervisions? Do we need inductions? But we can see here, these are extracts directly from the legislation. So it's very clear that you must have an induction programme that prepares staff for their role. Then we talk about staff receiving ongoing and appropriate or periodic supervision to make sure their competence is maintained. Some people call those one-to-ones, touching base. However it is that you look at it, there is an expectation that you have oversight as a leader of how your staff are maintaining their competence. But you also need to think about from an induction perspective, before staff then work unsupervised, what level of involvement are you offering? What does the induction process look like? And then making sure that you, as a registered manager, it's very important that it's you as the registered manager are confident that your workforce can then work unsupervised. Again, often when out on inspection, you will hear that some of these roles are delegated to other staff members. So it's, it's the team leader's responsibility, it's the office manager's responsibility. But if as the registered, and that's fine obviously to delegate tasks, but if as the registered manager, you yourself don't have oversight and assurance about the competency of your workforce, then you could be in breach not only of Regulation 18 that we're looking at here, but Regulation 7 that we touched on earlier, because it would demonstrate that you yourself don't have the competence to run a safe and effective service. So again, it touches here on the regular appraisals, so making sure that you've got those in place. And then thinking about how you as a leader acting in a way that doesn't prevent your staff from obtaining further qualifications or developing in an area that they might be particularly interested in, or that they need to develop in order to deliver their role safely. And then if we move to the next slide, we've got Regulation 19. So this is the third one of the requirements for this particular quality statement, and this is the fit and proper persons employed. So essentially this is looking at your safe recruitment processes. It's strange, and I think probably when we were preparing this presentation, it is strange to think of these three pieces actually aligned with the words capable, compassionate and inclusive. But like I said, when you do a deep dive into them, the processes that the CQC are looking for is an evidence category, and there are quite a number of things that you need to have in place to demonstrate this from a leadership perspective. So here we're thinking about your recruitment processes and making sure you've obviously done your relevant checks. Interestingly, it talks about employing unfit people or continuing to allow unfit people to stay in a role may lead the CQC to question the fitness of the provider. And when we go into this in a bit more detail, when we look at the ratings, what I touched on earlier is the fact that, there's a layer of leadership that you have to get right. So you yourself as a leader have to be competent and skilled and experienced. You then have to employ staff who are competent, skilled and experienced. And if your processes don't demonstrate that you are managing your workforce effectively, then both of those strands will come into question and will potentially lead the CQC to breach you or to give you a poor rating. So it's important that you get both of those areas right, yourself and your workforce. And then again, we're thinking about staff who work for the making sure that you provide up-to-date training in order to maintain competency, and also making sure that any reasonable adjustments are put in place from the Equality Act 2010. Hopefully everybody's familiar with that, but it's really important that you are considerate of those adjustments that might need to be made from that perspective. So if we move on to the next slide, what we've done here is we've broken down the particular quality statement. So you've got under Well-Led, you've got 8 elements, 8 of the quality statements, and then within each of those quality statements, they are then broken down into multiple parts. So there's always more than meets the eye with the CQC. So this particular, the first part of capable, compassionate and inclusive leaders is looking at whether leaders have the experience, capacity, capability and integrity to ensure that the organisational vision can be delivered and that risks are well managed. So again, just for visual purposes here, anything that's in red is an extract from a report that was rated inadequate by the CQC last month. Anything in orange requires improvement. Blue extracts are outstanding, and we've got some green extracts later on that are rated good. So just to help you there. So interestingly, you'll see here that the care home reports that were rated inadequate, they really demonstrate here the importance of Regulation 7, which we touched on in the beginning, about registered managers needing to have the necessary qualifications, competence and skills, because we can see that the CQC have pulled them up, that the risks haven't been fully considered when taking new admissions into the service. So that's the registered manager's responsibility to monitor risk. And the provider was not working in line with legislation to ensure the service was appropriate. So again, the CQC have immediately identified the registered manager themselves or the provider didn't know the expectations from a legislative or a compliance point of view. So it's important that you know those. If we then move on to the next slide, we've got part 2 of this particular quality statement. So there we go, perfect, thank you. So this one says here that leaders at every level are visible and lead by example, modelling inclusive behaviours. So we've got some really nice outstanding examples here. So we've got leaders and managers supported staff when they did raise concerns, and that leaders worked closely with staff and others to make sure they prioritised compassionate and inclusive leadership. So again, the CQC are feeling confident that you're, as a leader, as a leadership team, that you are visible, that you are role modelling compassionate and inclusive behaviour, and that then as a result, staff feel confident to come to you with any concerns or to raise any issues, particularly when we're looking at incidents, accidents or near misses. Again, it's very common for those to be underplayed maybe, or to be misreported because staff don't feel confident to come forward and talk about those due to the risk of, you know, them not being received appropriately, feeling unsafe in the workplace, maybe concerns that the manager would treat them differently as a result. So those are some clear examples from an outstanding point of view. And again, we've got a nice one from a good service that staff told us there was an open culture within the practice. The leadership team were approachable and they felt comfortable to raise any issues. Arguably, there's not too much difference between the outstanding and the good there, but I'll leave that for the providers to pick apart. So, and I think just really importantly there, although Regulation 17, which is good governance, isn't picked up on in a huge amount of detail in this particular quality statement, we know that Regulation 17 leads the way for well-led. So again, if you're not familiar with Regulation 17 and good governance, I would encourage you to read a little bit about that. But that particular registration reiterates the importance of providers seeking and acting on feedback from people using the service, from their staff and from other stakeholders, so that they can continually evaluate and drive improvement. So it's really important to hold on to that. So if we have a look at part 3, thank you. So here we've got high quality leadership is sustained through safe, effective and inclusive recruitment and succession planning. So this here links to Regulation 19 and a little bit of 18 that we talked about. So 18 is the ongoing CPD and commitment and development for your staff. The Regulation 19 is about the recruitment part. So you've got a requires improvement service here at care home that received a requires improvement rating because staff weren't always recruited safely. The CQC found gaps in recruitment records and they were not then effectively audited. So again, when we're thinking about the full circle, it might not be your responsibility day to day as the registered manager or as a provider to do the safe recruitment checks, but you need to audit them, you need to have oversight and make sure that you're confident with the systems, the processes that are happening. Otherwise, you're looking at Regulation 19 concerns, Regulation 18 concerns, Regulation 17. So it's really important from an ownership perspective. And then, yeah, we've got a nice quote here from a GP practice that had a good rating and they were commended for their succession planning. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, but succession planning is something that's very important, but not always well considered. So it was great to see that within a report. And it's also really, I think, really important that the CQC are now embedding that into their expectations from a well-led perspective. So last but not least, we'll move on to part 4. So this here is the expectation that leaders are knowledgeable about issues and priorities for the quality of services and that they can access appropriate support and development for their role. So again, we talked earlier about getting yourself in a good place and getting your team in a good place. So this one here is particularly about how you as a leader get yourself into a good place. So we've got kind of opposite ends of the spectrum here. So we've got an inadequate rating of not all staff having the necessary levels of skills and experience to meet complex needs. And then the provider needed to consider the skill sets required as part of the current admission process. But then you've also got an outstanding rating given to leaders who had a good understanding about risks and implemented actions to mitigate such risks, particularly when it came to the business growing too fast to be able to maintain the personalised care provided for patients. That's a really common and a good way of demonstrating good or outstanding services, thinking about business growth, not taking on too much before, trying to run before you can walk, and actually having your staff, your team leaders, being able to have those conversations with you and making sure that you feel confident that the service you're delivering is safe and effective. And then here we've got from the GP practice that requires improvement. Clinical leadership and supervision were not always provided. So I think probably the key word there is not always. That would suggest that sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But if we think back to the evidence categories that we talked about and the processes, the importance of getting your processes right, they need to be consistent. They need to be embedded into your policies, your procedures. Staff need to know what the expectations are. You need to know what you're hoping or able and committed to delivering over the space of a year and ongoing. So you cannot have inconsistencies, because that's where you will find a requires improvement rating. And interestingly, it said, although staff told us that leaders were approachable at any time. So that's where, again, to keep talking about it, but the evidence categories are really important, because the two evidence categories are staff and staff feedback and processes. So on one hand, the staff are telling the CQC, the leaders are approachable, their door's always open, we can go to them whenever we like. So that, for example, would score you good. But then if you've got inconsistent processes, that is what would drive you down. And the two quality statements to get the two scorings of those evidence categories coming together need to be right. Otherwise you lose scores, you potentially get a poor rating. So it's aligning those two elements together, I think. So, there's part 5. So if we move on to part 5, so leaders are alert to any examples of poor culture that may affect the quality of people's care, that could have a detrimental impact on staff, and they address this quickly. So again, here we're talking about the procedures that you have for monitoring staff, thinking about competence and how they demonstrate that they can work in a caring and compassionate approach. So we've got really positive feedback that staff spoke highly of the culture of the team and particularly of the directors. Staff were supported in their roles to enable them to support people living in the home. So there's a real kind of a sense there that the leaders are looking at the culture, the overall culture of the service, and then any risks that do come up, they're addressing them. But again, we've got here that word inconsistent, similar to the last one where they said not always. So the word inconsistent arrangements to deal with any behaviour that didn't align with the vision and the values of the service is really important. You want to be hearing that is happening all the time, that there are robust processes, policies, procedures in place, things like that. So before we go on to the grilling of with the inspector questions, we've just got a couple of slides for you here, just some top tips, some food for thought for you to take away and think about. We took your feedback on board from the last webinar, and the two slides are things that you can ask yourself, so sort of self-reflective questions, and then the next slide is particular evidence that you could capture and use for when you meet with the CQC, or if the CQC contact you and are asking you to upload information onto the portal. I know we don't like to talk about the portal at the moment, but when the portal's working, that's where you will be uploading your information. So things such as feedback evidence. So we're thinking about staff. When we talked about earlier the importance of staff feedback, how do you know that they're happy, that the culture is strong, that they feel included, that they feel able to talk to you? We've seen very clearly that it's one thing if staff tell the inspector that, but you need to have evidence from a process perspective. So what action plans have you got? Do you keep logs? Thinking beyond staff surveys, thinking a little bit more creatively about other ways that you can capture staff feedback. Again, looking at your CPD records and evidence of implementing any tools that you learned within the workplace. So keeping records of your training, your development, but then going beyond that and actually demonstrating how you embed those into your day-to-day business. So if that's, you know, talking about them at team meetings, holding, you know, away days, events, anything like that. Your supervision and your reflective log. So if you're a small practice and you are the provider and the registered manager are the same person, or if it's in a particularly small clinic, it might be that you're receiving external support, so from a mentor, you know, another clinician, for example, but making sure that you keep hold of your supervision and reflective logs would be really beneficial. Again, thinking about incidents, accidents, near misses and lessons learned, particularly where do you as a leader record your involvement in these, and where do you show you've identified learning for yourself? So it's not just about, you know, we've picked up that there's an incident that's happened, we've dealt with it, potentially some lessons have been learned for the whole business, but really what about you as a leader? Is there anything you were able to reflect on about your practice that contributed towards that? And what might you do differently? Or have you identified that actually you need refresher training in a particular topic? So thinking about yourself just as much as your workforce there. And then succession planning, again, really positive to see that this has got a bit more of a spotlight within the new quality statement. But what is your succession planning strategy and plans, kind of a pipeline plan for the future? So things may include ring fencing or sourcing external funding for training, looking at your one-to-one and team meeting records with staff who may discuss or express interest from a CPD perspective, thinking about your recruitment pipeline, and then celebrating staff success. So what methods do you have in place for that? And we spoke about rewards in the previous webinar, actually, so hopefully you can, if you weren't here, you can catch up on that conversation that we had about rewards in the workplace as well. So that draws that particular part to an end. Now, I'm not sure if Ketan has been able to join us, so it might be Gary.
Yet.
So it might be
Gary first.
Yeah,
I'll try and take all four if not.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So these questions here we've just put together. Again, these are questions that I might speak to, or that I do speak to providers and registered managers about, you know, when I'm out doing mock inspections or when I was working within the CQC. So again, a chance for you to maybe take these back with your team if you're doing reflection, if you've got your appraisal or anything coming up, if you're planning for an inspection, you can take these away and think about how you might answer them, and then get some, hopefully some top tips from Gary as well. So question number one. So as a inspector or an ex-inspector, I often hear managers say, I have an open door, staff can always speak to me. So it's a very common thing that managers will reflect on. So apart from on a physical premises where you literally have your door open, and again, that's often what I'm shown, look down the corridor, there they are, the door's always open. But we think now about remote working, we think about hybrid working, we think about different size practices, satellite services. So what other ways as a leader can you demonstrate that you are open to communication, feedback and discussion?
Okay. Well, I certainly, that open door policy, yeah, I get that. I would have said the same thing. I think I use that. It's a bit of a stock answer, but I think it's a bit of a lazy answer, and it relies on others being proactive and taking the initiative. And if communication's, you know, a two-way thing, it's not really working. And I think the danger with saying, you know, the doors are always open, and as I say, I can remember saying it, and our partners would say it as well, is that, you know, they might then go and speak to the staff, and the staff say, well, we never hear from partners or practice managers. So I think it's far better to be proactive. And I was talking to a practice manager only a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying how early in the morning she would go around and speak to all the staff. Now I can think that, you know, when I was in practice, I would, at lunchtime, instead of having lunch at my desk, I'd go and spend lunchtime with others. But just going around, you know, the practice or your organisation, making sure you're speaking to others. I think, you know, being proactive in that, whether it's a dedicated time or just, you know, random and flexible times, but making sure you're going to other people so they can report back, yeah, the practice manager, the GP partners, whatever it may be, come to us. And I would say, don't just go to the ones that they're your favourites or that you're comfortable with. go to the ones that actually you might hear something that's uncomfortable, because you want to find out what's happening. You want to find out, you know, the good and the bad, so you can put things right. And I think the last part of that sort of the questions, or thinking about, you know, how you can really be open, making sure that just when you are doing it, that you've got time, you're not rushed. And I know it's really, really difficult in practice, but make sure you're there, you're present, you're listening, you're engaged. And also making sure it is two-way. Share your thoughts back and opinions, and, you know, let people know what's going on. So that's how I would do it. Be proactive, go out to people, don't rely on the door being open, that people will come to you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Gary. Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you made at the end about, it's one thing saying that you're available, but actually having the time to be available is really important. Whether or not you have to manage protected time in your diary, you know, as a way to ensure that because a staff member could come to you and say, it's nothing wrong, I'm very happy, everything's going fine, but they could come to you with quite a significant amount of things they want to offload. And if you're then clock watching or saying, oh, I've got another meeting in a few minutes, can we pick this up later? That's when you're immediately going to hit barriers from a leadership perspective, aren't you? And potentially you're not demonstrating that you're compassionate, that you're inclusive, or potentially even capable of from a leadership perspective. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you. And actually, if anybody here on the webinar is working for a remote clinic, or, you know, has hybrid working, it's really interesting to share some ideas about how you manage that from a desktop perspective as well, where we talked about where you can't physically have your door open. So Ketan has joined just at the right time. So thanks, nice to see you, Ketan. So straight into the hot seat questions for you. So question number 2, being a bit harsh here, but I rarely come across good examples of succession planning. In a nutshell, what does this mean to you? And can you provide 3 top tips of how to get it right?
Yeah, that I've seen very few good examples of that as well. But it's so important. And actually, I think the more good leaders you have, the better, obviously, in any organization. But if you actually have, for example, a PC and CD who's excellent and does lots of things, that can create a bottleneck. And you actually never know when things are going to change. Maybe they can no longer continue in that post, or maybe they decide to have a change of career, or whatever it may be. And you don't want to be left in this situation where suddenly you're trying to find alternatives and find a replacement. So actually, I think when identifying that, it can be great that you have somebody in place, but actually, whilst you have them in place, it's worth thinking about, what does this role actually need, whatever that role might be. So if it's a CD role, for example, and more importantly, what might this role need in the future? And so you really need to know, before I even go and think about who the personnel might be, what kind of a person do they need to be, and what kind of strengths are we really looking for? Following on from that, then you can start to potentially identify people within your pool of staff who might actually fit into that approach or that culture, or start to actually put things in place to develop that. That leadership journey isn't a solo one. It needs to be a team process in any case. And so you want to give responsibility to people and see what comes out at the other end, how they take that on, and how they can actually respond to you, making suggestions as to how they can develop. So you're almost developing a mentorship whilst you have somebody in place. And that's the key. So when that time comes, that transition will be as smooth as it possibly can be. Also accepting that no two people are the same. People will have different approaches to doing things, but your ethos and culture of what's going on in your organization is absolutely key. And to make sure that whoever it is next is actually still following that ethos.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Ketan. And again, I think that's a really good point about not relying on staff who, you know, might be particularly interested in lots of areas and taking on a lot of roles and responsibilities outside of their, you know, their fundamental scope, because there is a risk that they could leave and that you as a manager have become over reliant on people to do additional tasks. And actually, if they do leave, or even if they go on holiday for a few weeks, or if they become unwell for whatever reason, you've then got yourself in a situation where a huge amount of tasks, especially from a quality perspective, aren't being overseen. And that's, that'll be when the inspector wants to have a look at data or information, and you can't necessarily provide that assurance. So it is thinking about how, as a whole team, you come together and you work together and look at that succession planning. So Gary, question number 3, as a practice manager, did you ever fall behind on your own professional development, and what were the consequences? And what tips can you give to leaders to maintain theirs in an already very busy environment?
Okay. I mean, the first thing, I think many practice managers would sort of say, well, CPD is not a requirement for PMs. That's the obvious, easy answer. But if we put that aside, CPD is important, and you can break it down and say, well, you've got the mandatory training, keeping up to date with changes in whether that's what's coming out of the NHS, technology, legislation, and there's also your own areas of interest and sort of developing those as well. So if I think back of, did I keep up to date with it? No, not very well. I think mandatory training, particularly with the one that you have to do, it was often done last minute when you knew CQC were coming in, or it was at the end of the year. And I think the danger with that, and whether it's you or a GP doing it or any other member of the team, the danger of doing it last minute is you rush through it, you tick a box, and you don't really have that sort of protected time where you're properly learning. You're just skimming over the surface and just ticking a box. So, I think that's one of the dangers. I think if you then sort of turn to the keeping up to date with everything that comes out of the NHS and legislation, and technology and things, I know that when I wasn't keeping up to date with that, if I was coming to it late, it may be that I'm not informed enough and I'm not getting the most out of whether it's the technology or something that's changing in the NHS. It might be I'm asked for opinions or advice from, whether it's GP partners or other staff, and I'm not able to do that as well. So, that definitely there was an impact if you're not keeping on top of things. And I think that, the last area I think that falls under the CPD is sort of your own professional development, the things that interest you. And I think if you don't keep on top of that, you're going to get frustrated, you're going to get bored and restless, and it might be that you're moving on. So they are all really, really important. In terms of how you keep on top of it, it's tough at the moment, isn't it? In practice, there's no time for these things. I would say make sure that when it comes to appraisal time, that you're emphasising the importance of this to you, as whether it's a practice manager or a GP, whatever your role in the practice. And I would also say, get some time out, even if it's once a month and it's only half an hour. Get some time, put it in the diary ahead and protect it. Try and find the times where it is a bit quieter, whether that's the end of the day or really early, first thing in the morning. I believe, and I spent long enough in practice and right up into COVID, there are times that you can find, whether it's half an hour, and make sure you protect it. I think in terms of, what might help is sometimes there might be things you can do with others. Learning together is always good. So I would advise, that's one thing. And the other thing is measure the impact of what you're learning. And, when hopefully you've learned something, you put it into practice, measure the impact, even if it's only reflecting on it yourself, because I think if you can see the impact of it, you're more likely to say, okay, this is valuable, it's important, I'm going to keep on doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really like that point about reflecting on the impact. And when, again, we touched on it earlier, didn't we, about the importance of processes. So if you yourself as a practice manager are undertaking training and then you can see the benefits of that, it might be that you as a result have streamlined a process, that you've had a more meaningful team meeting with a staff member, that you've been able to reflect on some conflict within the workplace, anything like that. If you can then reflect on it but also demonstrate through the evidence that you're collecting, then that would be a fantastic way to demonstrate compliance under this particular quality statement. So yeah, I think that's a really good question to ask yourself about the impact. Thanks, Gary. So last question for you, Ketan, question 4. So can you give an example of where poor culture has or has not been picked up by the registered manager, and what was the impact of addressing or not addressing this?
Oh, I have quite a few. So I'll kind of culture is so important, but one of the ones which in the current climate is really important is a normalization of being overworked and micromanaged. So it's really important that on some level you give staff that room to grow, to make mistakes, and to try and figure out what's going on, and then be open enough that actually you can help them progress. However, if you, for example, have told your reception team you must answer X number of calls within an hour, or you told your clinical staff that this needs to be done, admin or number of patients seen, but you haven't really got behind that, and I haven't really asked them, one, do you think that's feasible? And if it's not feasible, why not? What's stopping you? What makes it difficult? Then that's a case of micromanaging people, and actually they may go and kind of try and do that, but you'll probably find that things start to happen. People call in sick, and people stop thinking of solutions because they're too scared to come to the manager to say, well, what about if we did it this way? You haven't been open. I think you've just tried to get somebody to follow instructions, and so you haven't had that empathic inclusion at all. And when that stops, that culture is really hard to get on top of, and it's easily missed because you've got things above you that you're being told you need to, the number of calls that are dropped off are now being monitored, and all these things, and that transmits down to other people in the team who actually answer those calls, for example, and that really needs to be picked up. And when you find that somebody is technically underperforming, actually, rather than cracking the whip, perhaps actually say, well, what's going on with that person? And that's when you need to start to get to the root of that culture.
Yeah.
So kind of, well, actually, why is that person not actually being able to keep up, for example, or why is that person feeling that they can't be at work as often as they should be? Take the approach completely differently.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think, yeah, two really important things there. One about normalizing making mistakes or getting things wrong. You know, in order to have a compassionate and inclusive workforce, you need to be normalizing that sometimes things do go wrong, and that's okay. And it's how you as a team can learn from that, and particularly you as a leader, which you touched on at the end there, how you can reflect on what it is that you might be doing and the culture that you're creating as a manager that could lead to things going wrong. You know, if, for example, you're seeing repeat occurrence of something that shows poor culture, there's obviously more to it than just, you know, it's not one particular, it's not an isolated incident. So things that you can reflect on as a team and as a manager there. So that's been really helpful. Loved that. Thank you so much, Gary and Ketan. And I will now hand over to Claire before we then come to the questions and answers from people.
Thank you, Gabby. There's actually a couple of questions in the chat already specific to DBS checks that you might feel able to answer in the chat.
Right, I'll have a look at those now.
Yeah, so have a look at those. Really fascinating. What I hadn't appreciated until now was that bit about how, sure, your staff may say you're inclusive and you may talk about having an open door policy, but if you're not able to back up what your staff say with a process or some sort of evidence, then that's not good enough. And I suppose nor is the opposite of you showing that you've got something in place and then the CQC surveying your staff and then them saying otherwise. You need to have both of those bits complementing each other for the CQC to say, yes, you are actually doing that. It's quite a high standard, I suppose, maybe appropriately so. This is patients we're talking about at the end of the day. So I'll talk to you just very briefly about the Well-Led provider and what we can do to help with all of this. So the platform that we provide has been going for about 7 years now, and we've established quite a large selection of clients along the way. In the last year, we've been bringing practices and PCNs on board, and they're using it to develop their team and their leadership and their individual team members within the organisation. And there's two kind of principles that guide us with what we provide as a service. The first being that we believe that a team, a leader, or any member within that team is the best person to develop themselves, and you can only develop those things so much with an external person. You need to be driving it yourself, but you need the tools and resources to do so. And that's what we hope our platform provides people with. And the second principle behind everything we do is that we believe that everyone in an organisation, no matter how junior or senior you might be, whether you're a clinician or a non-clinician, everyone should have access to the same level of developmental support. And that's what we hope to think that we provide. So the usual process that our users go through is that they set up some sort of diagnostic, if you like, to get a sense of how they're doing and where things can be improved, as kind of survey of staff, if you like. There's no other way to find out whether your staff feel included other than asking them. And we've seen from regulation, I think it was 19 or 17, I can't remember now, Gabby, that you're expected to not only seek feedback from staff, but then actually act on it. So you can use our diagnostic tools as a way of ticking that box at least. Your staff will fill in a simple survey with some smiley faces. They do it anonymously. They can give comments as well, and they can give you an idea of what they really feel are the priorities for your development. And then you get a data-rich report breaking down all of those responses and comparing how your staff have responded to how you as a leadership team have responded. So you can see if there's a little mismatch between what your staff feel and what you feel you're delivering. And we also benchmark you against other organisations in our database. So if you do our practice-wide diagnostic, we benchmark you then against other practices for you to use yourselves in whatever way you wish. For example, to show to the CQC that you are doing better than the average of the practices in our platform. We then will direct you to some guidance and some exercises that we recommend you do to develop those areas that have come up as needing improvement in, and those exercises are all on our platform for you to dip in and out of over the course of your subscription to our product. Particularly with reference to this quality statement, capable, compassionate, inclusive leadership, this is the sorts of questions that our diagnostic tools will ask your staff. Are you encouraged and confident to speak up when there's a mistake, either that you've made or someone else has made? Do you feel respected and valued? When your leaders tell you they're going to do something, do you feel confident that they will do it? Is your organisation making the most out of the skills and the knowledge that you have? Do people take responsibility when things go wrong? Do the leaders appropriately address performance management, even in the most senior members of the team? And on the right-hand side there's some examples of the exercises that we give you to go away and do, either as a group or as an individual, to help improve your performance management if you're a line manager, or to look at the culture within your team and whether you have what we call a blame culture. And so that's some stuff that people can get started with right away. And then, of course, you can redo a diagnostic and hopefully you can show that you've improved a little bit in that particular area. So that's what our platform has to offer for this particular bit of the CQC. And these are the prices that we provide for primary care. If you're not from primary care, just contact us and we'll be able to give you an idea of the pricing. We have some options for people who feel that they need more support around our platform and need help and regular checking in to make sure that you're making improvements as a result of the diagnostics that you've done. And we also now have what we call a CQC Plus package, where the lovely Gabby will come in, or virtually if you prefer, do a mock CQC inspection over a couple of days for you, not just on the well-led domain, but on all of the key questions in the CQC framework. And she will also then follow up with you for the whole year, making sure that you're doing your action planning, you're gathering all your evidence together, and you're getting aligned with all of the requirements. So that's our offer to you. If you'd like to do a very quick demo of our platform, just to get a feel for what your staff might be doing, if they click on a feedback link, you can scan this QR code now or click on the link. You can actually do it live on the screen, it should work. But remember, you're getting these slides at the end. And we'd love you to complete our feedback form too at some point. If you do that, you will then get the slide deck through for yourselves to use as you wish. And we'll be sending that link out afterwards anyway, so don't worry about filling in the feedback now. You'll get the link in an email afterwards. And these are our contact details. How are we doing with the Q&As? Have we got any? So Gabby, it looks like you answered one about DBS.
Yeah, so there's been a couple of questions there about DBS. checks. So particularly about renewals, which, you know, it's a common misconception that they have to be renewed, you know, every 3 years or whatever it is that you hear on the grapevine. So essentially there is no renewal date for a DBS, and the hyperlink that I've provided in the chat will take you to one of the CQC Mythbusters. Again, Mythbusters, if you're not familiar with them, they can be really, really helpful. So that will just reassure you that there is no renewal date. But what's really important is that if you decide to have longer renewal dates between you know, longer periods of time between renewals, that you feel assured from a risk management perspective. So just completing those risk assessments. Again, if your staff are on the auto update system, then that makes it, you know, significantly easier. And then about risk assessing administrative or reception staff, so non-clinical staff, if you don't consider their role to be a risk. So yes, you're right, you don't have to DBS check those particular staff members, depending on the specific duties or responsibilities that they come up against. So if, for example, there's guidelines about if, for example, they're working or supporting children, thinking about if they have to supervise a child maybe while their carer or parent is having an appointment, if they are supporting from a chaperone duty perspective, or if they thinking about medical records and access. So there are some risks that you need to consider, but if you choose not to DBS and you just want to build that into your risk assessment, then that's fine. It's really just about providing assurance. And when we go back to Regulation 19, which is fit and proper person, so the safe recruitment process, that's really where the CQC will be looking for assurance. And then there is a question that I can't answer. I'm happy to go and find out, but it's about immunisations.
It is, yeah.
It's not something I know the answer to, but I'm sure between all of us at the Well-Led Practice, if we don't know now, we can go away and find out.
Yes, looks like the question is about IMS status for staff that have an incomplete or unknown immunisation record, and therefore do you need to start from scratch immunising them, or can you do some sort of risk assessment and say, because of what we've done, we don't need to do any more IMS? Can we get back to you afterwards about that one, Angela? And we will respond to it. I imagine the answer will be it depends, and do a risk assessment and decide what to do, but we'll see if we can find something specific for you. Thank you, Angela. Thanks, Angela, she's fine with that. Any others from people? There's still time. Raise your hand if you want. Checking the Q&A now, I don't think there's anything in there. You're welcome to email us all. Here's our details. We're on LinkedIn. You can guess our NHS email addresses by looking at our names. Do let us know if you'd like to find out any more. Question from Mahi. Will you cover which documents will be excellent evidence to submit? Or are all these verbally communicated to the inspectors? Gabby, what do you think about that question?
Yeah, so I think if you refer back to the slide just before the hot seat question, so that's when we gave a list of some of the examples of which documents you could submit. So they would include, for example, your supervision, so your one-to-one logs that you are having potentially, or your reflective logs that you're having with your provider if you're the registered manager, or if you're receiving external support from a mentoring or supervision perspective, your development, so your continued professional development records, and as we spoke about, when Gary touched on the impact, so if you are then noticing an impact, a positive impact from the learning and embedding that into the practice, then documents that can evidence that, such as your team meeting records, your training records. It might be that as a result of some training, you've introduced a new strategy, that you've been able to update your policies and procedures in a more kind of modern or compassionate way, so you can attach those and link the two together. Any action plans or feedback that any feedback that you're gathering, and then the action plans that you are developing as a result of that. So we often talk about, there's one thing getting the evidence, but then there's something about what you do with it. So going beyond the staff surveys, and that's hopefully what the Well-Led platform can support you with, is once you know how staff feel, there's then lots of guidance and action plans available for you to take that a step further. Again, succession planning, so if you have got a strategy, if you've got a pipeline, if you've got a plan for that, thinking about your safe recruitment processes, and then performance monitoring. So as Ketan touched on, you know, if something does go wrong, it's not about cracking the whip or making staff feel that they're working in an unsafe or a unsupportive environment, but actually how those are tracked, monitored. Are you picking up on particular trends? What lessons can you learn from those? How are you then communicating those, not only with that one particular individual, but the wider team? So are you having conversations? Do you identify that your workforce need additional training on a particular values perspective, culture perspective? So thinking about things like that, but when you get the presentation, they will be on slide 17 for you.
Thank you, Gabby. So it sounds like the short answer is no. Maybe they're not just going to rely on your word. They want to see evidence. Is that right, Gabby?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they'll want to see evidence. They'll want to see processes. So we talked earlier about the evidence categories, and it will be beyond you just having a conversation with the inspector or staff telling the inspector that everything's fine. They need to actually see it.
Thank you, Gabby. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. As I said, feel free to email us afterwards, get in touch by all of those means, and we'll be in touch with you anyway with the slide deck and the feedback. Thank you very much for tuning in. Lovely to see you all. See you again next month for the next one.